Welcome to Tell Your Story Alaska. Real Alaskans, real stories. I'm your host, Billy Turnland, and here is your story. Welcome back to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. I am excited about today's episode, especially the preparation for it. If you've listened to previous episodes, then you know that I'm kind of a history nerd. I love reading history books, and I did quite a bit of reading for this one because it is about the Alaska's history of discovery. We're going to talk about the first explorers of Alaska, when that happened, and who these people were. And unfortunately, it's going to be a very incomplete list because the list is kind of long of the number of explorers, and I would have spent probably 5 years preparing, which I didn't want to do. I've just gotten back from a pretty big trip, and so if I sound a little bit tired, you'll have to excuse me. We were gone for quite a while, and we did like this red-eye flight to get back. And if you have young toddlers, I highly recommend red-eye flights. You know, if you ever try to entertain a toddler for 7 hours on a plane, it's like miserable. But if you do a red-eye flight, they sleep through the whole thing. It is worth losing sleep for the kids to sleep on the flight. But you do have to make that sacrifice of getting a good night's sleep yourself. But I'm telling you, it is worth it. So that's what we did. We just got back from a big trip. And it was a really nice trip for my family and I because we were able to step away from Alaska and kind of look back at our lives in Alaska and just get some really good perspective. We just had the best discussions about our future and how we're moving forward and the things that we want to be involved with and do. And we're just coming back now full of kind of vigor and excitement and refreshment besides the lack of sleep. So, yeah, now that I'm back in my cabin where I do my recording. I built this cabin on my property. It's kind of separate from my house, and it's quiet and private. I've got the wood stove crackling, and it's nice and warm. And in fact, it's so warm, my wood stove, it gets so hot, I have to open windows to keep the temperature at like a normal temperature because it gets so hot. But that's a good problem to have when you're in Alaska. Anyway, I am in my happy place. I'm ready to record. I've got my notes in front of me. So today is a good day, and I'm looking forward to going through the history of discovery in Alaska with you. So here we go. The first true expedition to Alaska was the Alaska natives themselves. No matter the bravery required to discover new lands by Europeans, no one else can make the claim to be the first Alaska discoverers, except for those who have lived here the longest, which is the Alaska natives. Now, in some future episode, I want to make an attempt to answer the question of when that happened. When did the first native Alaskans come here? Why did they come here? And specifically, what is the date that they came over? Now, there's not much dispute that they came across the Bering Strait to enter the Americas. You know, there's some scant evidence that some people sailed over to the Americas, which is interesting, but almost certainly they came across the Bering Strait. But anyway, for now, I'm going to set aside that question today because it deserves more attention than just a quick word in one episode. But either way, the true earliest known explorers of Alaska were the native Alaskans themselves. So despite all the people we're going to talk about, I mean, all the credit to the native Alaskans as the true discoverers. Now, as far as the first discoverers besides the native Alaskans themselves, one source says that there's evidence of Russian settlements in Alaska during the 15th century, during the rule of Ivan the Terrible. If this is true, then they would be the first foreigners to see the shores of Alaska. However, the evidence for this is a bit scant, and I only found this in one obscure source, so I don't put a lot of stock in it, other than the people I'm going to mention may not be the first, but I'm still going to give them credit for being the first. So the very first likely sighting of Alaska was in 1648. Now, I say likely because the man I'm going to talk about never claimed that he found anything. And here's why. His name was Semyon Ivanovich Desnyov. He was a Russian explorer in search of rumors of rich furs among the hostile natives in the Arctic area just north of Siberia. So this is a man interested in money, not discovery. In 1648, he departed down a river with about 120 men and 3 other expedition leaders in a boat called a coke. Now, a coke is a smaller vessel. It's not like a big one that does ocean crossings, but a smaller one for exploring large rivers. In his search for furs, he made his way north of Siberia, out on the ocean, along the coast, and eastward around the tip of Asia, and back around into Siberia by the mouth of the Anyata River. Now, not much is known about his voyage, but all but 12 men were killed on this expedition, either killed or missing. Now, the ones killed are rumored to were shipwrecked and then killed by hostile natives, but we don't really know for sure. They're just gone. Desnyov was simply the only leader who survived the expedition, and so we can only speculate what horrific stories happened on that expedition, or perhaps the natives people were defending themselves in some way. We don't actually know. It's kind of wrapped in mystery. And, but I'm a nerd and I like mysteries. I really did a lot of searching for more information about this. There may be some kind of record out there, but I couldn't find it. There's only just a few articles. Okay, so in the area of the Anyata River where Desnyov ended up, he discovered a large number of walrus living there. He was able to procure over 2 tons of walrus ivory, making him extremely wealthy. He continued to explore that area in Siberia for many years until he died in 1672. Some people believe that on his journey around the tip of Asia that he made landfall in the Diomede Islands. If he did land on Little Diomede, that would technically be modern-day Alaska. Desnyov never claimed that he discovered the easternmost tip of Asia. He never claimed to spot North America, and he was not even attempting to prove that Asia and America were separate landmasses, which was a question a little later on. He was an illiterate man, so he probably did not understand the importance of his accomplishment, so he never shared his knowledge with geographers. This affected later explorations, the lack of knowledge about what he accomplished, which he didn't even know. It's kind of like Columbus did not even know he discovered America. He died thinking he had discovered a route to India, which is kind of funny. But Desnyov is similar in the sense of he did this journey around the tip of Asia and not even realizing what he did is the amazing accomplishment. But this does kind of strike in me a sense of wonder about like how many stories like this are out there that we have never heard of. Someone getting on a boat perhaps to discover or for, looking for riches or something like that and stumbled upon new lands, possibly America, that we don't even know about. I've enjoyed watching some documentaries, some shows, and read some books and articles about some very interesting possible evidence that there were people in the Americas even before Columbus and before Leif Erikson. So, maybe we can do a whole episode on that. I don't know. But at least Desnyov may have been the first to spot the shores of Alaska, because if you're going around the tip of Asia, then you're very, very close to Alaska. And almost certainly he saw the shores, although it's not recorded. So most likely Desnyov is the first foreigner to spot Alaska, although we're not sure if he landed there. Now, the next known explorer was another Russian, and his name was Mikhail Spiridonovich, Vazdev. He spotted Alaska in 1732 in a ship called the St. Gabriel at Cape Prince of Wales, which is the westernmost point in Alaska besides the Aleutian Islands. And now this is very near where Desnov sailed just 84 years prior. They charted the northwestern coast of Alaska and officially discovered the Bering Strait, although it was not named the Bering Strait for another 150 years. The reason for this is that because the area was later explored by a man named Vitus Jonasson Bering. Bering was a Danish cartographer in the service of Russia. His first expedition to America was in 1728, and he was setting out to prove that Asia and America were separate landmasses. Now, at the time, he was not aware of Desnov's discovery, which Desnov apparently was not aware of either, that they were separate landmasses. Back then, information did not spread like it does today. They didn't have internet where, if something happens on the other side of the world, everyone in the world knows about it. They didn't have the phones and all that. So this was unknown. However, Bering made it to St. Lawrence Island, and from there he made it close enough to see Alaska. But unfortunately, the day he was there, it was not a clear day, and he did not see the shores. But based on his notes, we're able to conclude that he was close enough to see Alaska if it was a clear day. But he reports it was not a clear day. So we don't think he saw Alaska then. So on that 1720 expedition, he did not prove that Asia and America were separated by water. However, he believed that he had sufficient evidence to believe that they were separate. On his way, apparently, he soured relations with some native people that he encountered along the way. I don't know the details of that, but it is very unfortunate. Okay, he finally returned again in 1741, but this time more prepared for a longer expedition. And he first spotted Mount St. It's either Elias or Elias. I'm going to say Elias because that's my nephew's name. So he first spotted Mount St. Elias on July 16th, 1741, which is in southeastern Alaska. And it's also the second tallest mountain in the United States at 18,008 feet, number 2 to Mount Denali. Now, after a brief landing there in that area, he was so sick that he spent very little time there, and he began his return journey. Unfortunately, he ran into a storm which separated his two ships. Bering's ship ended up exploring the Aleutian Islands to the south, and the other ship went northwest and explored northwestern Alaska, making note of many of the species that they saw living there. Unfortunately, Bering died, most likely of scurvy, on December 16th, 1741, before he finished his expedition. However, his name has been engraved in history because the Bering Strait, the Bering Sea, Bering Island, Bering Glacier, and Vitus Lake were named in his honor. His final resting place still remains on Bering Island. 28 other men also died on the expedition, probably of scurvy, and the remaining 49 were stranded on Bering Island, and their ship was in such poor condition it could not continue. The remaining men constructed a new vessel with the remains of their ship, and they were able to make their way to Avacha Bay on the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is in Russia, and it was there where they were ultimately saved. Out of the 77 men originally on the ship, only 46 of them survived the expedition. The two ships on the expedition were named the St. Peter and St. Paul, named after the apostles of Jesus. So even though he was not the first to sight or discover Alaska, he actually did not even technically discover the Bering Strait. But his achievements are still considered substantial because it was his expedition that gave Russia claim to the land. Later on, Captain Cook recognized Bering's achievements and named major geographical areas after Bering. Now, Bering's story is fascinating to me because I love early explorer stories. I have read many books on Shackleton's expeditions to Antarctica and also Scott's expedition and, what was the Norwegian's name? Oh, it's blanking on me now. Who actually made it to the South Pole first? Anyway, those are stories that I love to read about. And so Bering's story was especially interesting to me, that it was like this survival story, stranded on an island, and they had to make a ship and they made their way back. It's kind of one of those stories that should be more famous than it is. But hey, maybe this podcast will make Bering more famous, since so many things were named after him. And he's often cited in a lot of the stories as the discoverer of Alaska, even though we know there was a few people before him. All right, so it was the Russians who make claim to the first foreigners to discover Alaska, and they were also the first to colonize Alaska. And the first known colonization of Alaska was in August of 1784. The Russian-American company set up a settlement at Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island as a fur trading company. The settlement began with simple wooden buildings, an earthen-walled worker barracks, a school, a cemetery, storehouses, gardens, and animal pens. In just 3 years, settlements popped up in Cook Inlet Bay and Prince William Sound. From 1787 to 1798, the Russians began exploring the area to set up fur trading posts more inland. Unfortunately, the Russians took on a strategy of taking local natives hostage to negotiate for whatever leverage they needed to become the dominant of the two conflicting cultures. They also set up schools to start teaching native children the Russian language. The Russians were successful in procuring furs of sea otter, Arctic fox, and beaver, and they did pretty well doing this. Much of their success came from trading goods with the natives, who were much better at getting the furs, as they had much more talent in this area, as they have generations of experience. Now, with the lack of Russian women in these settlements, there was some marriages between Russian men and native women, and the children of these unions became relied heavily upon to strengthen the relations between the two cultures and for procuring more wealth for the Russian company. Now, according to my source, the Russians sought assimilation of the natives through the power of religion, and religion is a powerful force, unfortunately often used as a tool for political power, which is unfortunate, but the Russians leveraged this. They used specifically the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russians viewed baptism as an allegiance to the Russian Empire, and they found it to be very effective. However, many of the clergy in the church disapproved of using the church as a means of cultural assimilation, so this created some conflict. In addition, the Russians who had married native women had effectively stopped following the tenets of the church, so this created an awkward tension between all parties. But still, it was ultimately the Russian-American company that funded everything, including the church. So it was the company that held a great deal of control over the situation. Now, unfortunately, this is very unfortunate, with the arrival of the Russians also came disease such as smallpox, which the indigenous had no immunity. This became a pandemic. You know about pandemics because you know about COVID, but this was a true pandemic. COVID was nothing compared to this, because it's estimated that these diseases killed 50 or 60% of the native population across the whole state. Now, according to my source, the native shamans responded to the disease but failed to stop it. However, there was some success with vaccines administered by the Orthodox priests, which saw success in healing people. So it is speculated that this and the hard work of the Orthodox priests to learn the indigenous language that led to missional success by the church, so much so that even seminaries were established and a native Russian Orthodox priests were ordained. Even today, the Russian Orthodox Church continues throughout Alaska, and when I visit, many of the villages that I go to still have an active Russian Orthodox Church there. All right, here's an interesting story about a Russian man named Andrei Glazimov. He was a Russian and Alaskan by his heritage, and they call him a Creole. A Creole is just someone who is the product of two cultural heritages. In this case, he would have had a Russian father and a native Alaskan mother, and this gives him his own unique cultural background. that gave him advantages to be a bridge between the two conflicting cultures. Now, Glazimov was the leader of the first Russian expedition to explore and establish trade along the Yukon River in 1834. He began his journey in St. Michael's, where I've been and flown to a few times, and he made his way down the Yukon River and down the Kuskokwim looking for a way to the Kenai Peninsula. But ultimately, he had to turn back for lack of food. The following winter, he set out again to establish a trading post along the Yukon River. He selected a site that is today the village of Russian Mission, or the native name, which is Ikogmuit. He served as manager of that post until his death in 1846. Now, I only draw attention to this guy because there were many other Russian trade posts in interior Alaska, but I just point out this one because I've been to Russian Mission quite a large number of times. A lot of my flying is in and out of Russian Mission because it is the closest village to one of the camps I fly for during the summer, and I'm looking forward to going back this summer. All right, now there were several other attempts to colonize Alaska, and we're going to talk about those. The first one is Spain. This one's interesting because even before Alaska's existence was known by outsiders, there was something called the Intercaetera. This was in 1493, shortly after Columbus's discovery. This is called a papal bull, which is a declaration by Pope Alexander VI, which made claim that Spain was sovereign over the entire newly discovered world, over all the Americas. However, when this was declared, Alaska's existence and most of the Americas were still not known. But later on, upon hearing rumors of Russian explorations in the Pacific Northwest, the Spanish crown funded several journeys between 1774 and 1779. The first one to reach Alaska was Bedega and Quadra. They ultimately only made it to 60 degrees north, and they performed a symbolic act of sovereignty over the land for Spain. However, these voyages were no more than a quick trip to the area, and it had no effect. In 1789, Esteban Jose Martinez and Gonzalo Lopez made an expedition to Alaska to investigate this rumored Russian activity in the region. So on June 30th, 1789, they arrived at Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island, where Russia had established their settlement. He learned there that Russia had many other settlements and intended to occupy much more of Alaska. This, along with British claims to the area, led to something called the Nukta Crisis in 1789, which is a conflict that nearly led to a war. However, in the end, Spain relinquished their claims, which led to many British settlement attempts in the Pacific Northwest area, such as Washington and Vancouver. That conflict actually did not take place in Alaska. It was in the Vancouver area, but still it is related to these early explorers of Alaska. Now, the famous British explorer that I want to talk about is Captain Cook. Captain Cook is probably one of the most famous world explorers. His expeditions, he did 3 major expeditions around the entire globe, and the one for him related to Alaska is his 3rd and last expedition. Now, in January of 1778, he became the first European to set eyes on the Hawaiian Islands. At the time, he named them the Sandwich Islands after a politician back in England, which, for me, that seems a little silly. Why don't you name it something unique or something more exciting than a politician? But at any rate, from Hawaii, he sailed northeast to the coast of Oregon. And from Oregon, heading north, he mapped the entire northwest coast of North America for the first time. And on his way up, he encountered many Russian and native Alaskans along the way, and he had friendly trades with them. During this time, he kept a journal, and he described the people that he encountered. Now, one thing I'd like to do is to do an episode on these early explorer journals because they describe what the people that they see. And some of these journals describe how they live, their appearance, their dress, their homes. There's one that I'm going to get to in a minute that describes their religious activity, which I'm especially interested in. So anyway, Cook made the first accurate, detailed map of the Northwest region from Oregon up north to Alaska. Cook was a very talented cartographer, which, it was that talent that led him to become the leader of these expeditions. And of course, his expeditions are pretty famous today. All right, so that's Captain Cook, and I would like to come back to him in later episodes. And also, I want to come back to this other guy that I've been reading a lot about. His name is William Dahl. William Dahl was like is it botanist? Is that the right word? He's a guy who loved to study various species of creatures. Specifically for him, it was mollusks. For him, what brought him to Alaska was in 1865, the Western Union Telegraph Company launched an expedition to find a route for a telegraph line between North America and Russia by way of the Bering Strait. So Dahl ended up becoming commissioned as an assistant to the scientist assigned to this expedition. The ship was commanded by a man named Charles Melville Scammon, and that name is significant for me because I have been to Scammon Bay, and Scammon Bay was named after Charles Melville Scammon, who was likely the first guy to explore that area. And I would really like to get back to Scammon Bay. It was a beautiful coastal town with a unique culture of its own, and I hope I get back there this summer. I was drawn to that place. One of the things that I had an idea when I was studying for this, I learned about the history of Russian mission, and I learned about the history of Scammon Bay. But it gave me this idea to study the histories of individual villages and just dive into them, try to talk to the people there and learn about what is the history of this village. To do like an episode of each of the 220 villages in Alaska would just be awesome. I would really enjoy that. Anyway, it's just an idea, so we'll see. Anyway, William Dahl's voyage took him to various areas in Siberia and Alaska. But along the way in 1866, Dahl found out that the lead scientist of whom he was working under had died. So being the assistant, he took it upon himself to finish the job, and he began exploring the Yukon where the proposed telegraph route would run. During this time, his expedition was actually canceled, but Dahl continued on his own expense exploring the Yukon River area. Meanwhile, while he was out on his exploration, the U.S. had purchased Alaska in 1867, and Dahl became the foremost expert on the area, and he wrote a detailed record of his discoveries in a book called Alaska and Its Resources. Now, I was able to track down this book. I have a PDF copy on it, and I have been reading it. I love this book. It has so many interesting insights. He makes vivid descriptions of the Native Alaskans' religious activity at the time, the way they dressed, the way they kind of mixed Russian dress with their Alaskan Native dress. And there's just such interesting observations that he makes that I would like to do a whole episode on, actually, about their religious activity and his speculations about what their beliefs were, what the worldview was. And so I think we'll get to that another day. Anyway, Dahl became respected in his own right for his knowledge of Alaska, and he was sought out for many expeditions into Alaska, including one that was with the famous outdoorsman John Muir, who is a really famous, people who love the outdoors quote John Muir all the time. And he did an expedition to Alaska, and he wanted William Dahl with him for his knowledge. Dahl was sought out for his knowledge of the fauna, the wildlife, and the native culture. Many of the species in Alaska that Dahl discovered were named after him. All right, so that was my last explorer was Dahl. There were several others that I wish I could get to, but for the sake of brevity, I cut it short there. But still, I hope you found this story of the early exploration of Alaska interesting and informative, and maybe, just maybe, it increased your interest in Alaska just a little bit more. So, hey, thank you for listening in. Now, according to other podcasts that I listen to and some YouTube videos I watched about how to make a podcast, they all say try to ask your listeners to comment and leave a rating. So if you've enjoyed listening to this so far, do a comment and a rating. Apparently, that really helps the reach of the podcast. So if you like what you hear, please do that. So that wraps things up for today. Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, this is Tell Your Story, Alaska. If you have a story that you want told, or you just want to reach out to me for any reason, please contact me at tysalaska@gmail.com. tysalaska@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you.